Hello, and welcome to chapter 25, and we're going to be talking about new global patterns. So, this chapter continues the trend we saw in chapter 24, with Western nations like Great Britain and the U.S. continuing to dominate large areas of the world. We're actually only going to go over two sections in this chapter. Section 1 on how Japan modernized, and Section 2 on how imperialism took place in Southeast Asia. The other two we're going to skip over because Section 4 is on Latin America, and that mostly deals with the United States. And Section 3 is on Canada, and it's Canada. So Section 1, though, is definitely something that the Regents likes to ask about, and we're going to be talking about how Japan modernizes. Right? You start to see some serious shifts. This is the Japanese royal family, Emperor Meiji, that we're going to be talking about today, and you see still retaining some elements of their traditional dress and so forth, but the emperor and his son, and definitely the older children, they look like something out of a European royal family or a European aristocratic family, and that was by design. Okay, so before we get into talking about how they modernized and so forth, let's first talk about some discontent in Japan. Now, the discontent was with the Tokugawa shoguns. Now, the Tokugawa shogunate ruled from 1603 to 1868. We learned last year that while Japan had an emperor, he was largely a figurehead, meaning he didn't have a lot of authority. The real power was with the shogun, who was the most powerful feudal lord and basically the military dictator, had total control over the warrior class and the government. The Tokugawas had seized power in the early 1600s, and they were still in control by the mid-1800s. They imposed a policy of strict isolationism. The Japanese were forbidden from leaving, and foreigners could not enter Japan under penalty of death. This was especially true of Christians, right, who were persecuted in the 1600s, in kind of, often by crucifixion. But ports were heavily monitored and patrolled to prevent foreign merchants from coming in. And like I said, the Japanese could not leave either. So during this time, Japan changed very little and still had a system of feudalism, very similar to what Europe had during the Middle Ages. Now, due to its lack of progress, the economy suffered. Merchants remained at the very bottom of society, the peasants were overtaxed, and there was little production on new goods. Plus, the Tokugawa shoguns by the 1800s were viewed as being corrupt, right? They were viewed as not looking out for the people and that they were lacking in strength. So many in Japan were becoming angry and resentful. The shogun soon faced a brand new challenge from foreigners that would result in Japan having to open up its doors. Now, Japan is very close geographically to China, so they had a front row seat to see how China failed to resist Western expansion in the Opium War and how China was forced to open itself up to foreigners with the open door policy. Now, Japan began worrying that they were next, and this actually happened in 1853 when Commodore Matthew Perry and a fleet of very well-armed, modernized American warships sails into Tokyo Bay. It was called Edo Bay back then, but it's Tokyo today. Perry, when he landed, he handed Japanese officials a letter from the U.S. And from the U.S. president and demanded that Japan open up its ports. Okay, here's Perry and his delegation and the Japanese. They were somewhat overwhelmed by how quickly, kind of the foreigners had industrialized and established themselves. They had heard about what happened in China, but now that it was literally at their front door, they didn't really know what to do. Eventually, they recognized that they had to accept the terms that were given to them, and so they agreed to unequal treaties with the United States and European nations. Now, remember, we've seen the term unequal treaties before. They were forced on China by Great Britain after the Opium War, and it didn't work out too well for them. It also brought a lot of humiliation to China, and now is bringing humiliation to Japan. So angered by these humiliations, the shoguns were driven from power, and the power of the young emperor was restored. Let me move me out of the way. Okay. Now, I put restored in quotes because it's not like the emperor wasn't sitting on the throne, but remember, he was largely a figurehead, and now he was given full control of Japanese government and society. Now, this started a period known as the Meiji Restoration. The young emperor that we just showed a picture of, he took the title Meiji, which means enlightened rule. All right, so that was a new title that he gave himself. Now, the primary goal of the restoration was to strengthen Japan. And they said the way to do this is through two methods, modernization and westernization. So these are very, very important to remember. These are kind of the two central tenets of the Meiji Restoration. they studied Western ways, right? They sent envoys to the United States and to Europe to learn about their societies. And they also brought foreign experts to Japan to instruct them on how to modernize. Now, there were several areas that Japan sought to bring reforms, such as implementing a Western style of government. Now, the emperor was given total power. Here you have Emperor Meiji again. But you notice how his style of dress had changed. He was dressing like the German Kaiser. Actually, the German government was the one that they found the most applicable for theirs. I don't know whether this was a direct tie-in to what to expect in World War II with Japan and Germany being allies, but in any event, that's who they copied. But they also copied the German style of a two-house legislator, okay, and this is called the Diet. I know it's spelled like when you're trying to lose weight, but totally different. And that's, copied off of the two-house legislator you see in Germany, Great Britain, even the United States, and it's still there to this day. That obviously is a modern-day picture. They also created a large bureaucracy for which they could administer the different departments of the government, and much of the attention of the government was given to strengthening the military. Military advisors from Western nations were brought in to change the Japanese army, right, to kind of turn away from the old samurai ways. Not totally, okay, the samurai mentality remained, but they weren't dressing in your kimonos anymore. You see these guys, they look like something out of the American cavalry. So that's, and also with the technology part of it. They needed to get more modernized weapons. In order to get more modernized weapons, you have to industrialize. So a Western style of banking system was put in place, modern factories were built, and out of this, powerful industrial families called zaibatsus emerged. They now assume the top level. There we go. So you see a Zaibatsu family in the early 1900s. They assumed the top level in Japanese society. This led to an industrial boom in the late 1800s. Now, Japan also had significant changes to society. I mean, you can very clearly see it from these pictures. You look at the men in these pictures, the older men, kind of the patriarch of the family is dressed in traditional, but these guys over here, they're dressed in three-piece suits. Okay, they look like something out of the United States or Europe. You see the Western style dress in the military. They decided to adapt and copy what were emerging as the superpowers of that world. They said we could be like China and dig our heels in, or we could change and try and be like the West. Now, in chapter 24, in the previous chapter, we learned of a major outcome of industrialization and modernization, and that's imperialism. Industrialization leads to imperialism in several ways. It creates a stronger need for natural resources. It also creates a sense of superiority over other weaker nations. Japan was now experiencing both. Now, Japan, it's important to remember, is a relatively small country with limited natural resources, right? It's not a big area. It's not like they got tons in the way of coal fields and iron and oil and all that other type of stuff. So in order to keep the raw materials flowing, it needs to, in order to keep the factories moving, they're going to need to expand. They're going to need to look elsewhere. So they're looking for control of foreign areas. It also had a modern army that it really wanted to show off to the Western nations to show that it could hang with the big boys, so to speak. Now, the first area to catch Japan's attention in this march towards an empire was Korea. Now, Korea, as you can see, here's the Korean peninsula on this map. That is the closest area. It was literally a land bridge to Japan. It's how humans first, hundreds of thousands of years ago, reached the Japanese islands through Korea. It was, kind of a crossroads in many ways. It was a source of competition for three countries. You got Japan looking at it, you got China looking at it, and you got Russia looking at it as well. For centuries, it had been a tributary state to China. Meaning that it had to pay tribute and be subordinate. Well, Japan wanted Korea for itself at this time, and this brought Japan into conflict with China in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894. Erase those. Okay, so here's Japan. Oh, here's Japan, here's China, here's Korea, right smack in the middle of them. Okay, and you can see how this is literally kind of, a tug-of-war match between these two. Remember, we talked about the Sino-Japanese War in Section 5 of Chapter 24 and how it was an embarrassing defeat for China. Japan used its modern army to easily defeat them. And 10 years later, Japan scored another big victory in the Russo-Japanese War, this time against Russia. And we talked about this, in a couple chapters ago, that Russia was one of those competing parties, and they really wanted this region, I'll just leave it up there, kind of coincidence that it circles it, Manchuria. Manchuria is a region, you see how it borders Korea, borders Russia, and obviously borders China. Very rich in natural resources. That's going to be a very important region when we talk about Japan's expansion and competition into this area. But we'll talk more about that in later chapters. In any event, Japan wins and gains more control of the area, particularly Korea, to the point where in 1910 it officially annexes Korea. So Korea is now officially part of a Japanese empire that is going to continue to expand. Japanese rule in Korea was very brutal. The Japanese were not known for being very nice rulers. We'll talk more about that in World War II. And it bred resentment among the Koreans towards Japan. Unfortunately for Korea, it wouldn't be for another 35 years, though, until World War II ends, that Japanese rule in Korea would finally come to an end. So, kind of wrap things up with this, Japan is now a major industrial power. Okay, they are trying to put themselves on the same level as Great Britain, Germany, and the United States, and they are very successful in expanding their influence throughout the Pacific. This is going to have major implications moving forward into the coming decades, but it's important to remember that it started with the period known as the Meiji Restoration. Okay, so that wraps it up talking about Japan, and in the next video we'll talk about imperialism in Southeast Asia.